Welcome back. How were your breakouts? You got loaded up on caffeine, your second or third for the day. There's lots of coffee everywhere. So if you want to just caffeinate out today so you can handle the 2 city blocks, go ahead and do that. If you just walked in, I'm Benji. I have the privilege of leading a team that you know as SAMSI. You're here for a panel on headwinds and tailwinds and what's facing getting shared mobility be more accessible, more affordable, easier to get to and cheaper than having to own a car, which are very, very ambitious goals that we have for the Shared Mobility 2030 Action Agenda. I'm not going to tell you about the action agenda. You can visit online or you can ask anyone. There's also a desk that talks about it. We're going to hear from people who are thinking about the future of shared mobility, and I'm going to call them up one by one, so help me welcome them. Gretchen Newcomb is the Director of Community Partnerships at MobilityData. Let's welcome Gretchen. Where's my walk-in music? Elliott McFadden is the Greater Minnesota Shared Mobility Coordinator and of the Minnesota Department of Transportation. Kathryn Hagerman Medina is the Head of Customer Success and Marketing for RideAmigos. Alex Esposito is the CEO and co-founder of Circuit. Jean Crowther is a principal at Alta, and she leads the company's innovative mobility services. And Mary Buchanan is Research and Policy Manager at TransitCenter. Welcome, everybody. This is a little disconcerting, right, to have your camera, your face on camera, and then now you have to turn around and hope everyone sees that. But we have a conversation over here. Hopefully you can see us all. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. Here's my first question, right? We created a Shared Mobility Action Agenda as a way to drive accountability and action. Not just principles of how we need more shared mobility, and that electrification is necessary but not enough. So I'd like to first ask you, each of you, what is your organization doing in terms of addressing climate change, equity, and easing the burdens on households, and that includes affordability, access, and safety? And I'll start in the order I introduced all of you. So Gretchen.
Okay, first is we are developing extensions that are leverages to improve equity and societal benefits, such as GTFS Flex, GTSS Fares, and GTFS Pathways. We're also, we do that in collaboration with the community, which brings our second impact, which is that we are building a governance model that promotes collaboration across the community.
Thank you. Elliott, tell us what MnDOT is doing.
Yeah, thanks, Benji, and thanks for having us here. So my program is the Greater Minnesota Shared Mobility Program. It comes out of what was at one time our statewide rideshare program that really just focused on carpool and vanpool. And when MnDOT kind of revisioned this program, it was to think about how we can involve more types of innovative mobility to address rural and small urban communities. We see a lot of focus in shared mobility on the highly urbanized areas where you have a lot of choices, you have a lot of options, a lot of business models can work. And there wasn't much focus on those smaller communities where maybe those solutions aren't able to scale down. So we're going to be rolling out some programming this year that's going to help create a pathway for new ideas that are focused on these smaller communities where we have a higher percentage of the population that doesn't drive, disabled seniors, people who can't afford a car, and they don't have very many options. So we're really focusing on how we fill the gap, maybe where transit is a good core service but can't fill every transportation need.
Thanks, Elliott. Kathryn, tell us about RideAmigos.
Yeah, sure. And I just want to say, now that I'm sitting close to Elliott, I can see he has really cool glasses with little bikes on them, so check them out at some point later. So there's a lot of really important work going on the supply side for shared mobility, but at RideAmigos we're working on the demand side. So our mission is to really change the way people think about commuting specifically, but transportation in general. So we create apps and programs that help with incentivization and nudges to help people make smarter mobility decisions, kind of moving away from the default of driving alone and optimizing the way that they use transportation, available transportation throughout their lives. And last year in 2022, we helped our customers, commuters using our programs, reduce 61 million VMTs, offset 20,000 tons of CO2 from commuting, and saved commuters over $27 million.
Fantastic. Alex, tell us about Circuit.
Yeah, so Circuit is a shared electric shuttle service. We work with cities, private developers, corporate partners to deploy shared on-demand services that are focused on short-range transportation, so first, last mile gaps. I probably don't need to tell this audience what a problem short trips are and what a contributor to greenhouse gas emissions and congestion are. And so that's where we stay focused at Circuit. And one example I think is Toyota Mobility Foundation in West Dallas identified a transportation gap in a vulnerable community, and that program's been a big success. It's now been embraced by DART and connecting residents in the area that were walking a mile to get to the local bus route as one of the many use cases. So shared, connected, local community mobility solutions.
Thank you, Alex. Jean, tell us about, Alta has been in this space for quite a long time. Tell us about what you're doing now.
Great, thanks. Yes, we were founded about 30 years ago focusing on active transportation and affordable and sustainable transportation. And so we've continued to work in that space and of course, have evolved in those decades of really capitalizing on multimodal transportation options now that are a part of mode shift and capitalizing on shared mobility's role and helping to kind of broaden that suite of choices that people have that complement active transportation and e-powered mobility.
Thank you. Mary, tell us about TransitCenter and the work you're nurturing in TransitCenter.
So TransitCenter is a private foundation that focuses specifically on improving public transit in cities across the country with the goal of making our cities and communities more equitable and sustainable. We do that through I would say two main areas. So one is research and policy specifically focused on what transit agencies and government agencies are doing, how they could be providing better service that serves riders better, how they could be, moving forward in innovative, equitable, and sustainable ways. And then the other area is that we are a foundation. We do make grants and support advocates around the country who are in their own communities really pushing for better public transportation, equitable transportation. So yeah.
Thank you. And for the audience, if you didn't know, all of their organizations are members of the Action Network that are supporting the Action Agenda. If your organization or public agency is not yet a member, please do sign up. That's my last plug. It's very ambitious when we put this together last year, and the goal is to replace private car use. And all of you, I suppose, are struggling with that uphill individually as organizations or agencies. And we hear about the billions of dollars that are coming through BIL and IRA, right? But just in terms of household dollars that are being spent on transportation, it's about $2.4 trillion a year. More than 90% of households in the US own a car, have to own a car, right? So when we say in the Action Agenda, we're going to make shared mobility, and when we say shared mobility, everything from public transportation all the way to safe sidewalks. As Veronica Vanterpool said earlier today, that public transportation is the OG shared mobility. So it's very ambitious. And then we look at the landscape and see, okay, there's a fiscal cliff, or there's funding from federal government. The VC money is drying up. Open question to anyone. What are the headwinds or tailwinds that you see? Headwinds that are against this goal, tailwinds that you think will support this goal. I'll open that up to anyone.
Well, I'll jump in to talk a little bit about business models, and I think there's both headwinds and tailwinds. I think the big headwind right now is what has happened in the private equity side of things, really both in the performance of shared mobility companies. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit of feedback here. Shared mobility companies that went public and maybe didn't perform the way we thought they were going to perform, and the sort of changing interest rate and tax structures and everything that are making it harder to get more money in. So there's more of a place where we're going to need to look at public sector and other options to keep bringing shared mobility forward. But I think there's a tremendous opportunity with a lot of the work that's being done right now with electric vehicles to replace the gas tax. Many DOTs with funding from the federal government are looking at how we replace the gas tax, which could be a platform, a generational change in the way people pay to fuel their vehicles, which means shared mobility could interact with that and create whole new incentives and business models and things like mobility wallets that can't plug into the gas tax today. So I think there's a huge opportunity that we need to be taking advantage of to make sure that we're in that conversation and helping to drive a change away from single occupancy vehicles.
So Elliott, I'm hearing from you, it's both a headwind, tailwind. The gas tax, which we have not raised since, when is it, 1993, is drying up. We need more resources. VC money is also drying up, and I'm going to turn to Alex to ask about that and differentiate how's it going for Circuit in terms of VC money. And then I'm going to ask Mary about the fiscal cliff. So those are kind of tailwindy, but I also like you're saying it's a moment to rethink, right? How are we going to fund all of this? So I'll jump to Alex first and say, is VC money drying up? How's it working for Circuit? How are you different from, if you're presenting and pitching, how are you different from the TNCs?
So, leave it to the startup guy to answer the VC question. So fortunately, we're not currently fundraising, so that's good. But I think we are slightly different than a lot of startups in that the majority of our funding comes from multi-year contracts, whether those be private contracts, government contracts, and so that does provide longer runways for the organization. I was going to say that a tailwind is actually on the public side. We've seen more funding over the last couple of years come from organizations that are working together. And so examples of those are NYSERDA working with the Department of Environmental Conservation in New York. In DC, the mayor's office working with the Department of Economic Development, with the Southwest Business Improvement District to build the Mobility Innovation District. Those types of things didn't happen years ago, where the problems have gotten so much more attention that you're now actually seeing multiple public and private organizations collaborate on initiatives that can bring funding to these types of programs. Now, these are just the early signs. I'm hopeful that this is a trend that continues to grow. But I think in the absence of some of the VC dollars that were out there, we are seeing public agencies work together more often, I think, than we have seen in the past.
I'm going to jump over to Mary because Alex is saying public agencies are coming and filling that gap. But we know there's a fiscal cliff for the transit agencies.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to turn over to Jean later and ask what's happening in city, and then Kathryn on the demand side, and then how data might be helping us, Gretchen. But Mary, what are you seeing as TransitCenter and the work you're doing? I think there was a big breakthrough in New York yesterday. At least our board member, Midori, who's on the board of MTA, was saying there's a big breakthrough.
Oh, yeah, maybe.
But what are you seeing and what are the challenges?
Sure, yeah, can't speak to the New York issue because I'm catching up. But as far as, transit agency funding, we're in kind of a tight spot right now. So, the term fiscal cliff is used, but really what's happening is that transit agencies coming out of COVID, received a lot of federal relief aid, operating support dollars, so that transit could keep running during COVID when they were tasked with moving essential workers, playing an essential role in communities, but they didn't have the ridership numbers that they used to fill some of that operating budget. So over the next 3-4 years, most transit agencies are projecting that they will run out of operating money if they do not find other sources of money, from federal all the way down to local, sources. So here in Chicago, I think they're projecting about a 20% budget shortfall annually. It's a lot of money. That's obviously a huge headwind. I think we can think about it a little bit as an opportunity to rethink how we fund transit. COVID certainly aggravated this problem, but it didn't create it. Transit has not had sustainable funding for a long time, and I think we should also be asking ourselves if it's correct to rely so heavily on transit riders who are sometimes, in the poorest kind of sections of our society, who are really relying on a service. Is it right to be, we shouldn't necessarily be returning to the old model where we were really dependent on like a regressive source of funding. So let's use this opportunity to see where else we can get money for transit and, while we're at it, not just create the system, go back to the systems we had in 2019, but get enough money so we can have like really good transit. That would be my hope.
Fantastic. We've been talking, it's federal funding and the end of federal funding for COVID. But 3/4 of transportation money actually comes from states and localities. And so, and not just for transit, but also for bike share or bikes, right, and walking. So Jean, are you seeing anything that's encouraging from what cities are doing? There was just a whole slew of building out of temporary bike lanes. A lot of cities had made them protected. What are the cities doing that you're seeing, your clients, and then what's the interaction between the infrastructure, which isn't necessarily for shared, and how shared services, shared bikes and shared scooters are helping or not helping with that?
Yeah, I think kind of a broad tailwind that we're seeing, I think, especially being in the transportation sector and having worked on that, elusive target of mode shift and getting people to change behavior and change their travel choices, that's a really hard thing to do in every community. And broadly, we are in a space where, in part because there's been so much disruption and uncertainty in the last few years, but also because we have this new infusion of funding, there is a lot of rethinking happening. And, not just in the strategies being applied at cities, but also I think travelers, people are kind of getting some new framing around transportation that to me is a real opportunity for us to really make some headway in mode shift. And the success of some of the recent e-bike rebate programs that are being tested out, just the huge demand that I think surprised most folks is evidence of that, just like slight changing, some more openness to transportation options. And I really do think that the shared mobility piece has helped people to think differently about, I have choices, and to really see a fuller spectrum. And so I think broadly that's a big tailwind, and I also hope that this infusion of funding that we have, along with that demand and changing about people changing the way they're thinking about their travel choice, is going to become infrastructure investment for bike lane and micromobility and e-cargo and e-cargo goods delivery infrastructure.
Are you seeing the climate conversation and the equity conversation playing up more in building out this infrastructure in the cities you're working with?
Absolutely. I mean, I think you have to say it's a headwind and a tailwind, but the urgency of climate action right now is certainly a major threat, but a real push and a real important tailwind. And we are seeing cities grapple with that urgency and that need to invest, along with the need for equitable ways of doing that. And honestly, urgency can make it difficult to make ensure that you're meeting equitable needs. You're doing it fast, right? But there is a lot of effort, and we're seeing the push to try to do that the right way.
So I'm going to turn to Kathryn, because you said something just before we got on that was, to me, like, all right, because we're talking about, and Mary said, clearly pointed out, we shouldn't make it a burden for people paying for public transportation, the burden of running public transportation and shared mobility is on fares or fees. You said people should be paid, which to me is a jump from, because we went from, okay, we'll subsidize your EV, your four-wheel EV, and then the states and cities are discovering e-bikes are really, actually, people are really interested. I think the difference is 10 to 1 now in terms of sales versus cars. But you're saying we should actually incentivize more of this by paying people. Tell us more.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at it, we've been kind of built ourselves into this situation. So we've been heavily subsidizing driving alone for a really long time. And we work with agencies in 26 states, Canada and Australia, plus employers all over the place, from 25 people up to giant multinationals with multiple campuses. And all across the board, you know, if you think about it, you get in your car, if it's an EV, you might have gotten a subsidy to purchase it. You might have some of your energy costs subsidized. You have these beautiful highways all over the place you can drive on. If it gets too crowded, you know, for decades we've just been building you another lane. And then you get to work and you probably have a free parking space. And so, I mean, I'm preaching to the choir here, I know that, but you know, we work with one employer who has not changed that. They still charge for give free parking, but they also fully subsidize every other mode. So transit passes are free. There's a free ferry. There's a free electric shuttle that will take you to work. They'll you know, subsidize your fuel if you're carpooling. They'll give you all sorts of subsidies, making everything sort of an even playing field. And just by doing that, they reduced their drive-alone rate by 25%. I've had other places where they'll just say, trade your parking for you know, an e-bike. And again, they get these like minimum 25% reductions in people driving alone. I think people want to, and you know, we've brought up a lot of different reasons here, from you know, CO2 challenges to equity to safety and affordability, but people want to make smarter transportation choices. It's just that it's really hard to change your thinking when there's such a powerful default that we've been building into. So I think, you know, Elliott brought up, like, you know, and we're talking about this fiscal cliff. Crisis is how evolution happens. And so this is both a headwind, but it's also a time when everyone is kind of coming together to think about how we can radically transform the way we think about these things. So I think it's a really exciting opportunity.
Benji, can I
Yes,
just
go
jump
ahead.
in one thing? I remember in one of the early work group meetings we had with the action agenda, so some of the original wording was like make shared mobility equal to the personal automobile, and then the discussion was actually we should be going beyond that, because the personal automobile is the incumbent market player or the incumbent player in the marketplace right now. And so to unseat the incumbent, you have to be better than the incumbent. So we need to be making changes. Your goal, whether you're a transit agency or a shared mobility provider, it's not that we need to be equal. We need to surpass and be implementing policies and incentives that make shared mobility more convenient, less expensive, blows the single occupancy vehicle out of the water kind of thing to get the kind of transformational change.
Alex is too humble to say it, but he was the one who pushed the action agenda to say it needs to be better, not just equal. Gretchen, tell us, all of this we've been talking about. I remember, I think it was in the very first, none of you might remember, the very first summit that UC Berkeley held. It was, I'm going to forget, SFMTA. And he had a presentation who was saying, your phone will make this all easy, right? That you can access that was before the term mobility as a service came around.
Right.
And between that and this decade, we've been trying to build out that infrastructure. Tell us about the work in data and related to how is it helping us govern this and getting to that vision that Kathryn had of giving people incentives, and it's easier to do rather than having to file something for HR and something else. Tell us what's
Okay, thank you for that, Benji. And I'm going to do a little context, first put in what I see as some very high-level headwinds that we're facing. Cox Evolution, a mobility study, recently stated that 35% of the consumers are actually planning on buying a car in the next 5 years. And while over a third of their consumers are open to transportation alternatives, single-use vehicles beat out mass alternatives by 78% in terms of convenience, practicality, and flexibility. So clearly we have a huge uphill battle. At the same time, what's happening right now is the automotive industry is committing $1.2 trillion to developing single-use vehicle, primarily EVs, through 2030, the same timeline as our action agenda. So after throwing money at the mobility wall for the last 10 years, beginning with Ford, if you remember, Ford committed in 2015 to 25 mobility experiments worldwide. One of them that came out of that was Chariot, which was based on informal transit, and it was founded in 2016, and they pulled the plug in 2019. So they have been throwing money at this for quite a few years, and they've gone back to something more safe. We're staying within our model, and that $1.2 trillion is a very big headwind to go against, the marketing dollars in those machines. But let's look at one of those tailwinds again. Over one third of the consumers are open to transportation. So boots on the grounds, what's happening is, I feel, is where our tailwind's going. Just came from the FTA talk where they talked about really focusing on carefree mobility. That's critical. It has to happen at the point of decision. Do I take my car or is there another alternative? And we at MobilityData believe that customer experience can be influenced through high quality, reliable data. And that's how we're going to impact that change. And with some of the other tailwinds, National Transit Database is about to require all reporters to migrate to GTFS. That's an over 70% jump of GTFS. That's a huge standardization that's going to happen. And then we're also very excited to be an EMI recipient, and we are going to be building an automated validator. Standardizing is the first step. The next thing is high quality data. This automated validator will level the playing field across all users regarding data, regardless of data capacity, and enabling them to improve their quality of data. So these are some very strong headwinds, tailwinds to improve this.
So standardization is one of those. If we get standardization, then we get connectivity. Getting to standardization requires a lot of, as you mentioned, Alex, and also I think it was Jean, kind of cross-working and working together of public agencies and private mobility providers. How is that going? Are you going to look at that and say, this is definitely a tailwind? Or is it, headwind, we have a lot of work to do? What do you think in terms of our ability as a sector to work together, conscious of two things? Again, in the context of our public agencies, although they're receiving money for capital, are strained when it comes to operating and facing the fiscal cliff. And the mobility startups themselves, even when they're healthy, are laying off people left and right. So what do you think? Are we able to get past that and keep partnerships going to provide people more mobility options?
Yeah, I mean, we have a regional mobility as a service program that's going on in Minnesota with a FTA AIM grant. And we have 13 transit providers, intercity bus. We've been having conversations with private mobility providers. And all of those conversations center around trying to figure out, what does everybody get out of this? What kind of framing all of these discussions in how does this improve the situation for everyone and meet needs and address problems? So I think that's a huge part of the conversation, is to understand where your different partners are coming from, what their needs are, and see if you can get an alignment there. I think the problem that we have right now when we silo everything is we're all fighting over this tiny early adopter customer segment, and the real market is the majority. The real market is getting beyond that to larger parts of the population. And that's not going to work unless we're all working together. You know, somebody who's lived most of my life either car-free or car-light, I choose the transportation option that works best for me. There's a whole palette. And it frees you in a lot of ways, but if those things aren't all working together, it makes it very difficult for people to make those changes. So we have to be making the case that, you know, that this data interoperability and sharing information is going to get us to that larger market.
Yeah, I wanted to add that besides the specifications and extensions we build in community, with community, one of the things that might be a little overlooked is the governance model that we're developing. That is facilitating collaboration. And it takes a long time to build a data solution that is as inclusive as possible. That could be a tailwind if you look at it that way, because often it's slower than the market forces really want. But that's how you build a reliable data that also is able to be accessed by the producers, the consumers, the planners, or the travelers despite their data capacity. And that's a really important role of building a culture that is necessary.
Yeah. Are you seeing that culture coming up with the people you're working with? I guess because there's positive things happening, yes, but I'm sure you've all hit walls where it's not in the city budget or whatever. Tell me about that. What are you seeing in terms of people and governance and working together?
I'll say that it, of course, I think is a challenge, and you know, the transportation system is complex, and there's a lot of partners. But I do think that there's a lot of progress in that kind of coordination and collaboration, in part because the transportation sector as a whole has, over the last few decades, has moved so far away from the silos we used to be in. We really are having those multimodal integrated conversations, even though there are still tension points and friction points. And I did just want to mention too the comment about kind of the car-free and car-light lifestyle and having a palette of options. I just wanted to acknowledge that has been, you know, an opportunity and something to work towards in urban environments, but it also was really important in the less dense and smaller urban and rural areas. And I think that's one of the opportunities that, you know, shared mobility and new partnerships and new coordination and new data and modeling can help to figure out how to make the palette work in those less urban areas where people still need choice and people still, you know, may have the opportunity to go car-free or car-light when they previously never would have thought that was possible.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, you know, without good data, none of that sort of collaboration is really possible. And in rural areas in particular, thinking about what the palette of options looks like, I mean, I think we're at a place where you have things like Circuit, the really, you know, good first last mile options that we never had before, informal transit, on-demand transit, things, and carpooling and van pooling that really do work well in those contexts, but you have to push people toward it. So I think being able to actually get people's attention and incentivize them to take a look and think about it and actually choose something that maybe takes a little more brain power for them to think about, how am I going to get there? I might have to take 2 modes to get somewhere, but it might actually end up being more convenient than driving alone, owning a car, and having all this stuff. So I think something that we've been interested in for a long time is we'll see an employer that has real reasons for wanting to shift the demand for parking or shift the demand for trips, whether it's from regulatory pressure or just cost to subsidize all that stuff. And then you have agencies that are either working on air quality or working on trying to make regional mobility work. And those two are just two that are trying to solve the same problem, but they're not able to coordinate and work together. So what we've been focused on for the last 5 years has been really finding ways for, a lot of times those are both our customers and they overlap. How do we make it possible for them to work together? And in fact, like, good data is a centerpiece for that. So that's finding ways that they can both trust the data, trust the results, and has caused them to be able to put more money into incentives and programs that are marketing these things.
Okay, I'm going to pivot a bit and then ask one more question, then we're going to open it up to see if there are questions from the audience. But Mary, to everyone first, but specifically to Mary, the theme of this summit is all together now, action and accountability. And from where I stand, right, the environmental groups are really strong on electrification, which as I said, and I think everyone agrees is necessary, but I think not sufficient. How do we talk, for all of us who are in mobility, we understand that getting people to share stuff is actually really better for the environment. And as our speaker earlier this morning says, it can be a diesel bus, but on a per capita basis, still way smaller in terms of GHGs. How do we all talk to the environmental movement and kind of, distract them from electrification is good, but sharing is really good too. And where are the funders, what's happening in that space? What are you seeing?
Yeah, I wish I had the answer to that. I'm hoping
Yes.
maybe I'll learn here. So I think that, public transit and shared mobility more broadly, I'd like to think of it as a tailwind, is that we are on the cusp, we're already in an environmental crisis, and we know that we need to reduce vehicle miles traveled, we need to drive less, we need to be less reliant on cars, and we need to live in communities that are denser where cars are just not necessary. And so shared mobility does play a really key role in achieving our environmental goals, particularly around transportation. But I do feel like there's a disconnect. I'm not entirely sure why that is, or just there's a lot of focus on electric vehicles, as you mentioned, but we're not going to meet our goals if everybody just buys an electric car and starts driving it tomorrow. It's still not going to happen. And so I think continuing to just, shout the message that transit and other shared mobility modes are much more effective at actually reducing VMT is super important. From from a funder perspective, making sure that it's not just that transportation, public transportation advocates are included in the environmental movement. Affordable housing, I attended a really great session on ETOD, all of those are solutions, and we also all do want to save our planet, I think, and so just making sure that we're not undercutting some of the solutions that we have. It is really important, but I don't really know how we do that. I'm hoping maybe we can all figure that out.
Well, you said it before. Anytime you're in an environmental group talking about decarbonizing mobility, who's coming in? It's the automakers. They're coming in. The tire makers. That's who's showing up, and that's great to see, but what they're really funding is trying to figure out how to keep things the way they are with a slightly less carbon.
Yeah.
I wanted to bring some examples up and tap into something you said about de-siloing. The first part is you have to de-silo data, and then you can de-silo some of the sectors and agencies. A few examples are, I heard Gabe Klein at Urbanism Next last week talk about what that...
Be here tomorrow.
Yay, that cross-agency group is doing. It's the DOE, the HUD, DOT, and EPA are working together to reduce greenhouse gases in the transportation sector. That relies on data that can be interoperable across the sectors. Mm-hmm. So the work that NTD is doing is really working towards that. Another example I wanted to give of how we're really accomplishing the working together, give an example of what happened with GTFS Fares V2. We just implemented the fare media, which enables all transit cards, all apps as well as bank cards to be visible on the app, as well as compare your pricing. Now this had, to enable to do that, you had to have at least a producer of the data, a consumer, had to commit in a public vote to do that. So it was a long process to do that, and Apple Maps, Interline, and CalITP set up. So now they are going to be implementing this and coming back to us with feedback. And this is really important because this app, this Fares V2, is the critical infrastructure capacity that towards realizing universal basic mobility. So they're building the blocks right now collaboratively that are going to enable these types of visions that we're talking about at SUMSI.
I'm going to say three. We're going to break the data silo. We're going to break the organization agency silo. We need to break those two. We also need to break the physical silos, right? Because it's like, oh, you get your bike over there and the bus is over here. Maybe it's a train station. And so that too, I think, is something we need to break.
Yeah,
Alex,
I was going to say, in a former life, I was a political consultant and worked with environmental campaigns from time to time. And I think some of this is generational. The previous generation of environmental movement was around stopping all development, stopping in an attempt to protect green space, but it was still very within the existing world that we live in with cars. So what ended up happening was that drove sprawl. It kind of did the opposite, or it created massive affordability issues. So I think what we're seeing in newer generations in the environmental movement is a focus on land use. So I think transportation needs to be hooking onto that, because those changes in land use that increase in densification does not work with everybody owning a vehicle.
Right.
It just falls apart. It's a matter of geometry. And so I think that's the opportunity there, and just having those conversations to start talking about, if you're talking about electrification, but you're also talking about land use and affordability and all these other issues, transportation has to be there, and we need to be at the table having those conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Go ahead, Al.
Yeah, just one thing to add. I think just we as an industry need to be better about bragging about the value of transportation to society. And I think I was in a meeting once with the mayor, and he said, well, why should we be paying for this? And I wanted to jump out of the window, because the more you think about, of course, APTA has their studies. For every dollar invested in transportation, you'll see a $5 economic return. But when you think about quality of life, when you think about air quality and the health implications, when you think about creating jobs, when you think about driving people to local businesses, reducing cars on the road and speeding up economic productivity, there's just so many benefits to shared mobility that I think we as an industry have really spoken a lot about, well, this program went well or that program went well. And I don't think we speak holistically enough, because if you're not in this room, you don't get it as much as we do, that there's a million different benefits, whether it be reducing commuting costs or the health benefits. The list goes on. And I think just broadly speaking, as an industry, I think we all need to be better about, sort of bragging about the value of the services, because they're not as obvious.
I would just add too, making it clear that people who drive also benefit if less people drive. It's true. And so if you have those people that are hangers-on, that are never going to give up their car, they should understand that shared mobility still affects them, and as it grows, it actually benefits them too.
Jean, you were going to add something?
Well, I just wanted to say, kind of more broadly, that I do think everyone here, everyone in this room, everyone in the transportation sector that is a part of the work right now and seeking funding right now, we all have a role in, yes, supporting the transition to electric vehicles, but also at every opportunity looking for how to achieve multiple strategies with any project, with any funding, because we know that EVs cannot be the one and only solution. And I think it's up to us to insert these other opportunities, to look for co-benefits, to look for ways that you can kind of tag together multiple strategies, because that ultimately is what's going to need to play out, and not to get stuck in what can happen when it's hard to collaborate, or when it's hard to figure out what the funding will allow and what it won't allow. So you have to get past those hurdles and really look for those opportunities to pursue multiple strategies.
I'm gonna open it up for a couple of questions. I'll come back to you all and ask, because you mentioned it, Jean. So people in this room, but who needs to be in this room or in this conversation that we don't already have in this conversation? So I think we have time for 2 questions. We're looking for questions. So you'll know it's a question if it ends with a question mark. And it usually is brief. But we're looking for questions. This is a small enough room. You can stand up, shout out your name, ask the question, and then we'll, of anyone in the panel or specifically someone on the panel. That gentleman over there.
So you all made me feel guilty that I have an all-electric Kia Niro EV that sits unused 97% of the time.
Yeah.
Talk to me about peer-to-peer car sharing networks and how has that been helpful to this transition?
You ran car sharing.
I was a founder of the first car sharing service in Texas, which was all sorts of trouble with my mic today. So I don't know. I have not seen the peer-to-peer model really work and scale yet. I think there are issues around like quality of vehicles, accessibility of vehicles, that I feel like having a company that actually has a fleet and operates it addresses. So I'm not. It's still a question mark. I haven't seen it. There's been work, and there's been several attempts at peer-to-peer bike sharing. There's been several attempts at peer-to-peer car sharing, and I haven't seen the model work really well yet. Whereas traditional car sharing is a pretty well-established model and can be quite sustainable. So I think it's still a question mark, and maybe, hopefully, if we're doing our job right, that's the last car you ever buy.
My wife drives a Kia e-Niro too. I think we should both sign up for Turo or something like that. Right? There you go. Another, yes.
Okay, so
Could you tell us your name and your organization?
yes, I'm Savannah Ward. I work with the Public Transit Agency in Chattanooga, Tennessee.
Chattanooga.
Yes. I have a question about shared use mobility. So for individuals, these types of services are typically app-based. So what happens when individuals don't have a phone or have access to a phone, can't use it due to age, disability, income? How are we identifying and bridging that gap?
Excellent question.
That's a lot of Fares V2 does that right now, and that was an issue that Fares was not complex enough as an extension.
Well, if I don't have a phone, what does Fares V2?
What they do is they enable you to get a transit card, or you can get a bank card. So there's 3 different ways to do that, and they're calling that underbanked or unbanked users, and there are a lot of solutions, but it does require an extension to the specification that can recognize that as well. So yeah, they do have those.
I have
Yes,
another point on that. So I think, it's a really good question. Adoption of mobile smartphones is really high in this country, and so I think more and more it's just ubiquitous. But I know of an agency in Texas that was saying to use their program you could get a free device if you don't have your own phone, and it was like the device only does occupancy detection for the HOT lane. I see other places where they'll have kiosks or something like that. But I think when we think about shifting people, it's about kind of crossing the chasm, getting beyond just that little 5%, but it doesn't have to be 100%. I mean, it's okay if some of the time some people still drive a car or find a carpool informally. What we're looking at is how do we need to reduce demand for car trips massively. And we need to just impact the people that we can impact. And it's finding a way to show them value. And I saw a really great analog one last night at O'Hare from CTA, a behavioral nudge as I'm walking, trying to get out of the airport. You could find your way to the ride share, which would be, maybe there are 2 people in the car, but it's still a single occupancy trip. before you get to that, there's like so many signs telling you like it's so easy, just go down here and you can get on the CTA, fast, safe, cheap, and like really this is just a cardboard sign. And you know, I know that I could take the CTA, but for anyone new to Chicago, I saw people look at that sign and then turn and go down the thing. No phone required. You can get a paper venture card, et cetera. So
just to answer that too, agenda item number 3 is we need to develop tools and incentives so that households and individuals can shift to more shared mobility. And that's not just apps, right? I'm jumping in as moderator. But also, I love the work of Equiticity. Obayi, are you in the room? They're going to take a tour. They take members of the community out for community rides to get comfortable being on a bike in communities that have been over-policed. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of hand-holding we need to do. It's not that just because you have a phone, then you can access everything. Mobility hubs, having them physically present. Indigo sort of solved this a decade ago when you could go into a convenience store and get the pass for the bike share, right, and pay cash over. All right.
Well, I
yes.
have one thing to follow up on that, which is that getting this data, I would say, just echo what you're saying, I think you'll be surprised there'll be more people that actually use this technology than you think within those populations. And there have been several projects throughout the country that have done booking for paratransit and demand response where there's actually a pretty sizable part of that population that uses it and likes it. But secondly, our transit agencies act as transportation managers for their community. If they can't provide a ride, somebody's calling in to dial a ride, they'll help connect them to another service. So those providers or a nonprofit that's buying passes for for their clients can use this information to be able to find the right ride for somebody that isn't using it. And then finally, the data that Gretchen's talking about feeds things like signs at the station that tell you when the vehicle is going to arrive, or texting services that tell you when the next vehicle is going to arrive, which are all much lower tech or don't demand as much as a smartphone, but still create that data and that sharing. So it's still worthwhile even if the actual end user isn't the one directly interacting with it.
All right, we're almost at time, actually 1 minute at a time. We're going to extend just a bit, just a quick lightning round.
So fast.
Who do you think needs to be in the room as Hamilton? Is it still okay to do Hamilton references? Be in the room when it happens as we talk about hitting that goal of making shared mobility way easier, way more accessible, cheaper, more sustainable, more equitable than using a car, which using a car isn't equitable anyway. Private cars, not shared cars. So who should be in the room? We'll start from Mary and then back up all the way to Gretchen.
I would say TransitCenter had a report a while back. All transportation is local. Local government needs to be in the room to provide the right types of transportation for their communities, and be the negotiators, I guess, and also the funders.
Jean.
I was going to say mayors. That obviously we need transportation professionals and partners of all types, but I agree about the local role, and so mayors and also the full political spectrum, being able to talk across political divides.
Alex?
I'd say the riders. I think that's the one thing the private sector and the public sector have in common. We work for the riders, and if the riders are here and the riders understand the value, they become the champions and everything will move a lot faster.
Kathryn.
Well, I want to say everyone, but I'm going to just say employers.
Got a really, really big bus or a really, really big bike.
Employers,
Yeah.
retailers, anyone who wants people to come to them, needs people to come to them, should take an interest in how those people get there. And that is huge. So we need all the stakeholders. Government obviously needs to come in, needs to put in more prioritize more funding for this, and they have with IIJA, but employers generate the need to commute every day for a lot of people.
What we're talking about here is regime change. The regime we've had for 70 years is automobiles as the regime. Now we're talking about shared mobility as a replacement for that. You need an economic aspect of that, and I think one of the strongest is the land development community, because we have to change also the way cities are built, and they have an economic interest. And so if you tie an economic interest to the policies, that makes it something that's sustainable.
Gretchen?
Yeah, I say travel doesn't stop at the borders. We need to support all open data standards in order to provide seamless, interoperable journey across, whether you're in Kansas City, Kathmandu, or just going across state or county lines. So we need to have all of the open standards in the room, and the elephant in the room, if we could use that phrase, is we need a principle in the room, interoperability.
Fantastic. So I will wrap it up with, I believe in complex systems. You mentioned elephants. I believe in butterflies. And in complex systems, the proverbial butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil will create a storm in Europe. So we can generate the headwinds, we can generate the tailwinds and minimize the headwinds. Join me in thanking our panel. Thank you very much.